All right. It is 7 o'clock, so you have some review questions on the board, and let's knock these out pretty quickly here. All right, what is the Hebrew name of the book of Numbers? Not in Hebrew. English would be fine. In the wilderness. Thank you. How many main sections are there of the book of Numbers based on location? 3 main locations that they camp at. What are the 2 main themes, at least that we've highlighted in this class? Teaching and choices. Teaching and choices. I think some of y'all are getting this confused with the next 2, so we'll get it sorted out here. The themes are like the themes of the book, and really themes oftentimes, you take them from the text, obviously, and the main things that are focused on, but there's also some amount of subjectivity with these are the things we're going to highlight in terms of what's being focused on and what we're going to take from the book. So the themes are teaching and choices. The main thing going on in the first 4 chapters of the book, organization. The main thing happening in chapters 5 to 9 or 5 to 10. Instruction. I think someone said that. Instruction. So, and then we'll get to summarizing all that in a second. But how does Israel respond in these first 10 chapters to all these things that God is telling them to do? Yeah, get a vigorous head nod from Muffy. That's you're reading through. They're doing what God said, just as Moses had commanded. Okay, they're obeying. That's what we see in the first 10 chapters. So here's your graphic breakdown of the 3 sections of the book of Numbers when they're camped at Sinai, when they are in the wilderness of Paran in the middle of the book, and then the end of the book at the plains of Moab, about to cross over the Jordan into the Promised Land. Also remember, and I like this structure here, especially because it helps us to appreciate the purpose of the boring censuses in the book. But remember, you can also think of the book of Numbers in 2 parts, 2 uneven parts, but one part where the first generation is counted, they are prepared for life in the wilderness, they go out and they fail, and there's a lot of death and punishment as a result of that. But then there's the second part of the book, and where the second generation is counted, they are prepared for life in the land of Canaan, and then they're sent out, and at least at the end of Numbers, we see some positive stories of victory settling the land and no stories of rebellion and death, at least for now, for the second generation, right? So that's another way that you can think of the book, and we are still in this period here, finishing up this period of preparation in the first 10 chapters or so. Here are themes. Remember that both of these themes fit into this larger analogy of Israel being the child of God, the Son of God who has just been born in many ways. The nation has just been established. They've received a law at Mount Sinai, and so they're in the very early stage. These are the toddler years, so to speak, for the Israelites, and God is instructing them as a father would a child, and He is disciplining them by giving them choices and then consequences for those choices. And so that's where those 2 themes kind of fit in to this literal and metaphorical journey that the Israelites are on. Okay, first 10 chapters, like I said, it takes place at Mount Sinai. When you think of Sinai, think about the place of preparation. And so when they are in the first 4 chapters being organized, where you're going to camp, how you're going to move out, what the Levites are going to carry from the tabernacle, this is the organization God is giving to their camp and to their traveling. And then in chapters 5 to 9, we have some instructions about life in the wilderness, okay? Getting defilement, moral and ritual defilement out of the camp. Laws about devotion, the Nazirite vow in chapter 6. There is this list of offerings that the people bring to the tabernacle to kind of kickstart the sacrifices and the work of the priests and the Levites there at the sanctuary. There's instructions for the Levites and their service, and instructions for observing the Passover now that they are over 1 year removed from the exodus of Egypt. All of this is preparation for life in the wilderness. Okay? So, let's pick up where we left off. And we're going to read here the end of chapter 9. We referenced this section on last week, at the end of last week's class, but I do want to read it. Numbers chapter 9. And it says in verse 15 the following. Now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and in the evening it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. So it was continuously. The cloud would cover it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud was lifted over the tent, afterward the sons of Israel would set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, there the sons of Israel would camp. At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel would set out. At the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud settled over the tabernacle, they remained camped. Even when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle for many days, the sons of Israel would keep the Lord's charge and not set out. If sometimes the cloud remained a few days over the tabernacle, according to the command of the Lord, they remained camped. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they set out. If sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning, when the cloud was lifted in the morning, they would move out. Or if it remained in the daytime or at night, whenever the cloud was lifted, they would set out. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year, the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, staying above it. The sons of Israel remained camped and did not set out. But when it was lifted, they did set out. At the command of the Lord they camped, and at the command of the Lord they set out. They kept the Lord's charge according to the command of the Lord through Moses. Okay, anybody want to summarize in like 6 words or less what all 9 of these verses are saying? They can't move until God tells them to move. That's what Cecilia said. Yeah, God leads them. When he moves, they move, right? Anybody in reading that, like, okay, enough already? Like, how repetitious and redundant could you be in describing what, again, we've described in about 6 words, okay? So why? I'll ask you that real quick. Why do you think this is drawn out here, and there are 9 verses reiterating this same basic thing over and over again? Robert? Takes away the loopholes, right? All the different kind of stipulations are covered. Time of day, length of time, staying, going. Yeah. Okay. What else would you say? Why is so much repetition here? Yeah. Brian says that all the iterations are a way of emphasizing the importance of God's guidance. And I think that's it. To Robert's point, it's thorough. To Brian's point, whenever anything is repeated this much, this is a way of the author underlining it over and over and over again. The people were not supposed to leave until God left, and they would stay as long as God stayed. And that is going to be their, literally, their guiding light through the wilderness, right? As a people of God, they follow God's instructions to stay or to go. All right, so that leads us to chapter 10, where we find this happening for the first time. Not right away. We get about 10 verses of more instruction. There's going to be 2 trumpets that will be used to call the people to assembly. These trumpets will also be used to sound the alarm when it's time to leave. And these trumpets will also be used by the priests in worship. Okay? But then, notice in verse 11, this is Numbers 10, it says, "Now in the 2nd year, in the 2nd month, on the 20th of the month." By the way, remember all these time periods here, time references, they're all starting with what? What's the reference point? Leaving Egypt, Robert says. Thank you. So, 2nd year, 2nd month, 20th day of the month, from leaving Egypt. The cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So you see, the text is describing what you see graphically on the screen. They are setting out from Sinai to get to the wilderness of Paran. And in these next several verses, all the way down to verse 28, you can overview it, or if you read it in preparation for class, again, another difficult section to read, all the names of the leaders of the tribes and the order in which these tribes moved out. But again, what this emphasizes is what they're doing here in chapter 10, 11 to 28. They are moving in the exact same order, in the exact same formation that God had commanded them back in Numbers chapter 2. They are keeping these instructions as God gave them to. He said, this is the order you will leave, and here when they leave, they follow that order. Okay? And so they're setting out, and they are now, in these next couple chapters, on the road between locations, between Sinai and Paran. A couple other stories. There's an interesting story in 29 to 32 where it's either Moses' brother-in-law or father-in-law. It's hard to tell, but his in-laws, he asked them to go with him on the trip. They live in this region. That's where they are from, Moses' in-laws. And so he asked them to come along. Maybe they're going to have some kind of expertise on the lay of the land, water sources, that sort of thing. They say, no, we're not going to go. Moses pleads with them to go, and it appears as if that's what they end up doing. In Judges chapter 4, verse 11, you may remember the story about some tent dwellers, the lady Jael who nails Sisera literally through the temple of his head. It explains in Judges 4, verse 11, that these are descendants of Moses' in-laws. So apparently these people did go along with the Israelites through the wilderness. And we read in verse 33 that they set out from the Mount of the Lord on a 3-day journey, with the ark of the Lord journeying in front of them for 3 days. You see this kind of great, to me, 35 and 36. Every time the ark left, right, they would all say, or Moses would say, "Rise up, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered. Let those who hate you flee before you." And when the ark would stop, the presence of the Lord came to rest. He would say, "Return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel." Again, calling on God. God is the one who is leading them. When he goes, they go. When he comes to rest, they come to rest. And so they've hit the road. In the first segment, only 3 days, right? I mean, what could go wrong on just a 3-day trip, right? Seems easy enough. Well, we'll see. All right. We've gotten to kind of the end of a major and, difficult section of Numbers. It's one of the reasons why we have blitzed through all this material, because now we come to, at least in our minds perhaps, the more exciting, more engaging content in the book of Numbers. These great, though tragic stories that we're going to read about what happens to the Israelites in the wilderness. So again, we shouldn't ignore all the boring material about organization and instruction. We hopefully have come to appreciate that to some degree. But when we come to chapter 11 and we start reading these stories about the Israelites in the wilderness, these are of particular interest and I think particular importance to us. I'm going to take a break for like 5 minutes here, and I want to show you a passage in the book of 1 Corinthians that I want us to have in the back of our minds as we start into these stories in the book of Numbers. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, "I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers," and who does he mean when he says our fathers? The Israelites. "Our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." Which sea was that? The Red Sea, "and were all baptized," Paul says, "into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." See the image, right? Cloud on top, water on the side. Baptized in the cloud and the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things, Paul says, took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. What is Paul doing here? Why does Paul describe the Israelites in this way, saying things like they were baptized in the Red Sea and they ate of spiritual food and the spiritual drink from the spiritual rock that was Christ? What's Paul doing in describing the Israelites in this way? There's a relationship that they have with the Lord, Michael. God is providing for them. But why is he using terms like they were baptized in the Red Sea and they ate of the spiritual food and spiritual drink? I see. So the relationship like an analogy or like a pointing forward. Thank you, Brian, for clarifying that. You see that Paul is describing the Israelites in ways that we would describe ourselves, right? Because he says, and explicitly says this in verse 6, that these things, the stories of the Israelites, these things took place as examples for us. That word is probably better something like models. the Israelites were a model of what we would be, to Brian's point, as the fulfillment of God's people. But they are a lot like us, right? And so there's a lot that we can learn from them and from these stories that are told about them. Keep going here in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 7. Paul says, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drank and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages have come." Okay? Paul references like 4 or 5 stories here. Where are these stories recorded? Almost all of them are in Numbers, okay? And some of them, it's not exactly clear which story he's referring to. The first one, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, is Exodus 32 and the golden calf incident. But the sexual immorality, we're going to see that in Numbers. The serpents, we're going to see that in Numbers. The grumbling, we're going to see that in Numbers. Paul is saying the stories of the Israelites in the book of Numbers, what's the purpose of them ultimately? They're examples for us specifically, Dan says, I think it was Dan, of things not to do. Do not be immoral. Do not complain. Do not grumble. Do not put Christ to the test. Okay? So that's the lens that I want us to have in front of our eyes as we get into these stories in Numbers, starting especially here in chapter 11. We are reading these stories as the people of God in our own way, having come through the sea of baptism and wandering or traveling through the wilderness, not yet reaching to or have not yet attained to the promised rest that God has provided for us, that we look forward to. So as we travel through the wilderness, Paul says, we are going to face these same temptations as the Israelites, and we need to learn from their mistake. Okay, because as much as we want to point fingers and laugh at them and say how ridiculous they are, Paul says, you're looking in a mirror. Okay? Don't be like them. Got it? See, that's kind of the lens we want to have as we look at these stories. So, now we can breathe a little bit, take our time, do like what we're more used to in these classes, and read a while and discuss what it is that we're reading. We're going to focus on Numbers 11 here for the next 15 minutes or so. And if we have time to wrap up this discussion and also talk about Numbers chapter 12, we will do that. But let's do what you're familiar with. We're going to read all of Numbers 11 in one reading. And then I'm going to give you some questions for you guys to discuss amongst yourselves and generate a class discussion that way. So Numbers chapter 11, starting in verse 1. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna." Now the manna was like coriander seed, its appearance like that of bdellium. The people would go about and gather it and grind it between 2 millstones, or beat it in the mortar and boil it in the pot and make cakes with it. And its taste was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall with it. Verse 10, Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you been so hard on your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laid the burden of all this people on me? Was it I who conceived all this people? Was it I who brought them forth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me, saying, 'Give us meat that we may eat.' I alone am not able to carry all this people because it is too burdensome for me. So if you are going to deal thus with me, please kill me at once, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness." The Lord therefore said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. Then I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take of the Spirit who is upon you, and will put him upon them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it alone. Say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, Oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, The people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot. Yet you have said, I will give them meat, so that they may eat for a whole month. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them, to be sufficient for them? Or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, to be sufficient for them? The Lord said to Moses, Is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. Also he gathered 70 men and the elders of the people, and stationed them around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and he took of the Spirit who was upon him and placed him upon the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do it again. But 2 men had remained in the camp. The name of one was Eldad, the name of the other Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them. Now they were among those who had been registered, but they had not gone out to the tent. And they prophesied in the camp. So a young man ran and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. Then Joshua the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. But Moses said to him, Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. Then Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. Verse 31, Now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. The people spent all day and all night and all the next day gathering the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. And while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because they buried the people who had been greedy. From Kibroth Hattaavah, the people set out for Hazeroth, and they remained at Hazeroth. Okay. A few questions I want you guys to discuss. It's a lot here, so I'll give you several kind of starter questions, and you guys can run with this in your discussions. First of all, what's the nature of the complaint? Why are the people upset? What are they complaining about? What provokes their complaint or complaints here in Numbers 11? Okay. Why is God so upset about it? Why is it such a grievous sin? Why is God's anger kindled against them in these situations? How does God respond in the story to what's going on? How are we, again, this is a 1 Corinthians 10 lens on the story, how are we guilty of the same sin the people are guilty of here in Numbers 11? And then what lessons are there from what happens here for? Okay, gather with those around you, discuss for the next 4 minutes or so, and then we'll reconvene and share out the best thoughts from your discussion. All right, lively discussion as I figured it would be. So let's share out what you talked about. What's the big deal? What are the people doing here, and why is God so upset about it? Maybe let's start with that. If we could try to hold back a little bit. I know we'll get to lessons for us in just a second. But what are the people doing, and why is it such a grievous sin? Okay, they were complaining about what God had given them, food-wise, right? He'd given them the manna. They wanted meat. They would have liked the leeks and the onions and the garlic. I mean, who wouldn't, right? But The meat is the thing that they say is said over and over again that they want. Brian, what would you say about what they're doing and why it's such a grievous sin?
Formerly, they were in slavery to Pharaoh, and it was Pharaoh that provided for them and treated them harshly. And now God gave them freedom, and Pharaoh is no longer their provider. God is their provider. But they weren't satisfied with the blessings that God gave them. They desired the things that Pharaoh gave them and demanded God give them food to fill their bellies rather than to obey God. And there's more, but you'll get to it.
No, thank you, Brian. Yeah, they want to go back to Pharaoh? Anybody remember how long they had served Pharaoh? Yeah, 400 years, round number, okay? How long had they been on the road here? Well, if you go all the way back to the Red Sea, it's been a year and a little bit, but how long had they been on the road since Sinai? 3 days? And it got hard, short-term memory loss. They seem to have forgotten the 400 years of oppression after a few days of adversity. Remember the good, forget the bad. Selective amnesia, right? What else did y'all talk about in this story? Maybe let's go ahead and move forward to lessons for us. So lessons for us, how we are guilty of the same sin. Since we've enjoyed a good laugh at the expense of the Israelites. How are we guilty of the same sin? And what lessons do we learn? And maybe specifically, what do we learn from God's response to all this? But let you guys talk. What do you guys discuss in your groups about lessons for us and our guilt in this matter? Yeah, John Albert?
To an extent, I think that something that this reminded me of as we're reading through this, being in the desert is not fun. Like, I know a lot of times we definitely kind of laugh at, it's been 3 days, but at the same time, if you think of the challenges that if we were all theoretically told to pick up and we're all going to go on a journey together and we're in the desert, it's not fun. I mean, you can't see food. There's going to be times where you go days without seeing water. Like, that is just from a standpoint, like, that's terrifying to think of. Like, you were in the middle of sand and there's nothing around you. But I think the lesson comes from the fact that, like, God, if we look at the story of where we had gotten to at this point, like, we've just gone through the Exodus story. Like, God has worked these wonderful miracles, shown his power, his might, his provision, but yet Israel is lacking that faith that God is going to see them through this time of transition from Egypt in the desert, moving to the promised land. He's going to see them through the time of lacking kind of what the desert signifies, is that there's going to be less, there's going to be lacking, there's going to be not enough. Maybe that God is going to see them through that time, leading them to an even better place than where they were originally. And that for us, the lesson is the faith through the desert, that we have to remain faithful, that there's going to be times where we're going to face these times of not having enough, the time of lack, but that faith should carry us through rather than being the people who, I think it said in verse 1 that they complain, or what, I can't remember the exact way that it was put, but how those who complain to God of their adversity, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that first line gets me, because I think, now the people became like those who complain of adversity. I think, put that on the, name placard on my desk. I'm one of those, they became like me, or I become like them. No, thank you, John Albert. Not minimizing the difficulty of the journey, but understanding that God has shown, as he said, his provision, and it's a matter of trusting in that provision through the difficulty, because God has demonstrated himself trustworthy, right? Michael?
I'm reminded of 1 Timothy 6, verse 8. But if we have food and clothing with these, we will be content. And, Paul is kind of warning about not falling in love with riches and pleasure and all that, but being content with God's provision. And so that's an application. I mean, it has a parallel here. God, he's provided so far. They've got the manna. They've got, and they're not happy with his provision. They're not content. They desire they think they know better, or they want something different than what God's giving them, and it's a rejection of his provision. So they're not content. They're unhappy.
Yeah. The greedy desires, thank you, Michael, mentioned in verse 4, are the root of all of this. As you said, not content, not happy. Same thing can be said of us when Paul says, if we have food and clothing, we can be content. Brian? And then Tom.
I think the clarifying parallel is expressed in Romans chapter 6, about 14 through the end of the chapter. But we, under the new covenant, were formerly under slavery of sin. And in that slavery to sin and slavery to Satan. And Satan gave us the things of the world by which we were satisfied in sin. But now we are slaves to God, slaves to righteousness, slaves to obedience. And in that, as a result of that obedience, we have sanctification, and the outcome of that is salvation and eternal life. But when we backslide, we want to go back into the world, just like they wanted to go back and get the things Pharaoh gave them. We in the spiritual realm of the new covenant want to go back into sin. And we need to come out of it and stay with God.
Well, thank you, Brian. And Romans 6 is a good passage to look at later in this regard. And I'll connect what Brian said with what Dan said earlier. You know, they only remembered the good, right? They only remembered the cucumbers and the leeks, you know. And they forgot the oppression. They forgot the, you know, like bricks without straw and all that stuff that we read about in Exodus. Same thing is true for us, as Brian said, okay? When we are tempted and when we start inclining ourselves to go back to sin and go back to worldliness, it's because we're remembering all the pleasures it brought us. We're remembering how good it felt to participate in that sin. We remembered the kind of the pleasure of fitting in with other people, the comfort of belonging in the world, right? The momentary freedom of I can do what I want. The independence of that, right? We remember that, and that all has this great allure as we look back on our former life, and yet we forget that when we were living that way, we were a broken mess, right? It caused us pain and heartache and sleepless nights, and our relationships were messed up, and we were unproductive in general, especially in the kingdom of God. We forget all that. We forget the slavery. We remember the pleasure. In the same way that the Israelites do that here too. Tom?
I believe the nugget in this chapter is in verse 16, where it talks about the elders coming to the tent of meeting. The Lord is going to take some of the spirit that he had put on Moses and put on these elders. And it says they prophesied. Now, prophesy has two meanings. It means one is telling the future, and the other is praising the Lord. Two of these 70 had not quite put their shoes on, and they're sitting in their tent putting their shoes on, and the Spirit hits them, and they too start prophesying and praising the Lord. A kid runs up to Moses and says, they're sitting in their tent with one shoe on, prophesying, should we stop them? And Moses says, no, I wish all of Israel would prophesy. I believe what this constitutes is an Old Testament day of Pentecost. In the upper room was this tent of meeting, and people noticed they were praising the Lord. On the day of the Pentecost, the people in the street heard them praising the Lord. So I think that that is an important part of this chapter, verse 16.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, it is interesting the parallels from what Tom just described to the life of Jesus, and then, as he mentioned, the beginning of the book of Acts. Remember, you know, the Spirit comes on the apostles, the spokespersons for God in Acts chapter 2, as a way of confirming that he was speaking through them, right? And you see something similar going on here where the Spirit is on these 70 elders. Interestingly, in verse 25, it says they prophesied for a time, but then they didn't prophesy anymore, right? Which would indicate that that was because this kind of initial prophesying was, again, like in Acts 2, to point everyone to their authority as the elders, as the spokespeople for God, or the representatives of Moses, okay? So that's an interesting parallel to Tom's point. Also, I don't know if this seemed familiar to you at all, there's a couple people, as Tom said, they missed the meeting, but they were a part of the original number. They're prophesying, and somebody comes and says, hey, these people are prophesying, right? But they're out on their own. Shouldn't we stop them? Does that sound familiar to you at all, of any other story? Joan? That's right. Mark chapter 9, 38 to 41, there are people casting out demons that are not among Jesus, immediate followers right there. And so the disciples say, hey, they can't be doing that. They're not one of us. And Jesus says, no, if they're not against us, they're for us. Let them do their good work. And that's essentially what Moses tells Joshua here. Interestingly, we get a little bit of a glimpse of maybe a young, eager Joshua like James and John in the Gospels or something. So that parallel is interesting as well. Steve, jump in here.
Yeah, I just want to say, that was half of Houston that was moving through the desert, to John Albert's point. And I can't imagine the waste and many other things that would go along with that kind of movement of people across the desert. And yet, the way this touches me is that God Almighty wanted them to be satisfied with that. And for me, we get upset because we didn't have a generator that had quite enough power, when the hurricane came. And we have all kinds of provisions, even when we lose our power, and yet we're not satisfied. Look at the homes we live in. Look at the cars we drive. For me, I may be more pitiful than they were. And I think that's something for all of us to consider.
Oh, thank you, Steve. I hope y'all if you weren't here on Sunday, you should go back and listen to the talks that were given by the several men that spoke on Sunday. All around this kind of, missed detail in the story of Jesus walking on the water, that Jesus the whole time intended to pass by them and leave them in the boat to, we might say, fend for themselves. But he wanted them to experience that adversity and that difficulty for a reason. And I was really was struck and moved by that. And it's to Steve's point about just our looking in the mirror about how blessed we are beyond belief, and yet how we still find a way to not trust, complain, and not be content with what God's given us. All right, not going to have time here I can go with Albert and then give Mike the last word.
I just, from plug for the class on Saturday, the men's group, we discussed James, and what popped into me was James 5, verse 7, and this is a challenge back then, a challenge for us. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. And in that discussion on Saturday, I thought to myself, how many days does a farmer go out and look at dirt and not panic? And the farmer knows what's happening below the soil. The farmer knows when the rains are coming. The farmer knows. And so I think a big challenge and lessons for them and for us is we're not patient, and our faith wavers.
Thank you, Albert. Mike, final word here. Surely you're not also going to James, are you?
I'll be quick. Stop your pity party and be satisfied with what I give you. In essence, that's what's being said here. And when it's not happening for us exactly like we want it to have, we revolve into that pity party. And, the same way that God got angry with them for not being satisfied, I'm sure he gets angry with us for not being satisfied, because that's not what this is all about. I'm done.
Thank you, Mike. And we're about done, too. I'll just kind of use what Mike said to say this, which is what he's saying. Complaining is not a small sin. Complaining and discontentment about our circumstances, it's not like, we all do that, Hopefully we've seen tonight that the anger of the Lord is kindled against his people when they are not content with what he's given them, when they are not trusting in him, when they are complaining, when they are grumbling about how they wish things were instead of, being okay with the way that things are. In fact, we'll get to Numbers 12 next week, hopefully, or we'll maybe just skip it. I don't know. I saw this from somebody, and this is it's not going to surprise you. There are 7 complaints in the book of Numbers, 7 times when the people complain. And actually, we've kind of seen 2 of them tonight, because if you notice, there was kind of 2 different incidents. There was the complaining about adversity, and then there was the more detailed complaint about the food. One was at a place that was named Fire, and the other one was a place that ended up being named something different because of the severe plague. But all of Numbers, in terms of what's the sin of the people, what's the failure of the people, it's a failure to trust God. It's a failure to be content. And their sin over and over again, 7 times in the book, is complaining and grumbling. Now, they're complaining and grumbling about different things. Sometimes they're complaining about not having water, not having the food they want. Sometimes, as you see, they're complaining about Moses' leadership and not being happy that he's the one that was put in charge. Okay? And then right in the middle, that hopefully we'll get to next week, is the main complaint that gives them the 40 years of wandering, which is complaining that they are not able to take the land that God had promised them. But all these have the same basic sin in common, complaining and grumbling. And so that's something for us to watch out for as we go through this study. And really, as I said, and as y'all have said very well, look in the mirror and see ourselves in it as well. So do Numbers 12, 13, and 14. We're still in Lesson 4 if you're using your booklet as a study guide, but we'll do those 3 chapters next time. And then real quick before we review, first 10 chapters of Numbers take place where? At Sinai. How does Israel respond to all this preparation that God is giving them at Sinai? Obeying. They're doing great. All right. Where do chapters 11 and 12 take place? On the road. Thank you, Robert. It's almost a trick question. Didn't fool Robert. What's the first complaint in the first? We didn't break this down, so sorry about that. What was the first complaint in verse 1 to 3 of Numbers 11? It was hard. The first one is just they complained of adversity. Right? Yeah, they complained of misfortune. They complained of adversity. What's the second complaint that takes up the rest of chapter 11? No meat. Right, no meat to eat. Okay? Third complaint we'll get to in chapter 12, but that's it. So we'll pick back up there on Wednesday, October 9th. Thank you, guys.